Hello. You're listening to my debut podcast, The Extraordinary Life with Jean Rule, where I go back and revisit some pretty extraordinary friends of mine in topical series. The first season is going to be this one on adoption and foster care. And my very first interview is going to be with my good friend, Nicole Etuk. But before we bring her into the studio, I wanted to give you some background on her story. I met her mom while she was pregnant with Nicole while serving or volunteering at a jail in upstate New York, Dutchess County Jail. I was facilitating a support group of sorts there for the women. And Yvonne came in. We became, I think, instant friends. And I remember hearing her story a little bit. Her family life was not that great. Her mom and dad were at odds. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that as we interview Nicole. Her sister had AIDS. Her brother had done this crime with her. The father of Nicole was in organized crime, and she really didn't have anybody to leave Nicole with. I had some friends that weren't able to have children and suggested maybe there could be a connection there. And sure enough, there was. And my good friends, John and Chrissy Thompson, ended up eventually adopting Nicole. It's noteworthy that in our area, there was a prison in New York, the only one in the country at the time that allowed inmates to keep their child for up to 1 year or 18 months in some cases in the prison with her. And so that's what Yvonne decided to do. She kept Nicole with her as she gave birth and then lived in her cell at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in Bedford Hills, New York. I would occasionally go to visit. And of course, Johnny and Chrissy, who had committed to taking Nicole on her first birthday, also went and visited often. I live probably about an hour away. And so that gives you a little bit of the background. Once we start our interview, Nicole and I felt that it would be special to go into a lot of detail about what prison life was like during that period of time, the late 80s to the late 90s for Yvonne. So bear with us as we share some background information early on in our interview. I know it'll be helpful to understand as we move forward and hear more from Nicole. Welcome to today's edition of The Extraordinary Life with Jean Rule. I'm here with my good friend, Nicole Etuk. Appreciate you being here with me, Nicole. It's really pretty monumental because it's our very first episode, and I picked your story specifically because it really sets tone for my life. So thank you for being here. Welcome to my program.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm definitely honored to be here.
Well, Nicole, I've already taken the liberty to fill in our listeners on what the circumstances were of me meeting your mom and then you being born in Dutchess County. Do you have any memories of living in Dutchess County? I know you were there for the first couple of years of your life.
Not a cognitive memory, if I could put it that way. The weird thing is like, and I know we'll get into some of this a little bit later, but um, I remember impressions, right? So I never really spent too much time in Dutchess County itself, but I do remember when I first moved back to New York, driving past the facility and feeling a gut feeling like, oh my God, this is, for some odd reason, this building is familiar. I don't know why, but I feel like it's familiar. And I remember saying it out loud. I was driving with my dad at the time, and he was like, "You were there." I was like, "What?" I was there. He was like, "Yeah, that's where the story kind of began." So I definitely impressions and gut feelings and familiarities have always been really big for me.
Yes, memories linked with emotions are really powerful, aren't they?
Right.
Can you recall the setting of your first year of life? I mean, I know obviously you don't remember it, but
Um, I remember certain things. Like I have images, like they're not clear memories, so where I can see the whole memory. But again, it's more so like an impression. and a lot of feelings. I do recall like certain pictures. I remember the playroom.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I could almost close my eyes and picture you playing in that playroom right now. In an article that we uncovered dated 1988, the Christian Science Monitor in that area, Katona, New York, published an article that interviewed your mom. And, I think it's worth reading a couple of her quotes because it really paints a picture of what your mom was like. So she's kind of a sassy person, really. 750 women, the article goes on to say, mostly single mothers, were living in Bedford at that time. The newborns, there were 24 of them in 1988. Yvonne is quoted as saying, "This year is important to me because my daughter will know me." Let's face it, Yvonne says, it's hard enough to be a criminal. To have a baby and for the system to take it away, it hurts. A woman did something illegal to live. She has a baby and society takes that baby away. I don't know if it's selfishness in living with my baby under these conditions or if it's selfishness to send her home, denying her me. So she was struggling with whether or not it was the right thing to have you there. Another article was published in the New York Times in 1993, and it talked a little bit from the perspective of the superintendent who had charge of the prison. Her name was Elaine Lord. She was a 44-year-old career corrections manager. There's been a lot of deinstitutionalization in recent years, Miss Lord notes, speaking of the mass evictions of the mentally ill from hospitals. And those people have to go somewhere. She goes on to say that for increasing numbers of women, that has meant prison. In the last 5 years, so this would have been around the time that your mom was there, the numbers of Bedford Hills women's rated as severely mentally ill had nearly tripled. In response, she set up a freewheeling, primarily candid program on family violence in which prison women bolstered one another in facing the memories of such traumas as incest, batterings, and rape. That kind of set the stage for what it was like for your mom. There was a mix in that prison, and I'm sure the year that you were there as well. So a lot of these women ended up in prison who were mentally ill, and that's got to be sobering. I think the takeaway there is, aren't you glad you didn't end up in that cycle? I mean, you would have been third generation. I don't know. Inmates, I get the
Yeah.
impression, although we never talked about it, that your grandparents served time at some point.
I don't know if her mother ever did, and to be honest with you, I don't even know if her father ever did. But I do know that that life of crime was definitely something that he also was involved in. Especially by the way that he passed away. I know he was a drug dealer himself. I know that she had him murdered. I don't know, if they ever came in contact with the institution itself, but I definitely know that that was a lifestyle.
It's kind of sad and sobering to think about what your life could have been like and where you would have gone, isn't it? There's a there's another glimpse of what prison life was like during that period of time through the writings and books of Jean Harris. Jean Harris was educated at the Laurel School in Cleveland and at Smith College. She got married, but later on in 1966, she met Herman Tanawar, who was back in New York. We all knew him as the Scarsdale diet doctor. He had sold a couple million books, and she had an affair with him or a relationship that lasted 15 years or so. She was convicted of killing him and was sentenced to 15 years to life. She had served a couple years before your mom got there, all the years your mom was there, and then a couple afterwards. And so she wrote a couple books. And so I had an opportunity to read several of them, and it's pretty sobering the way that she describes prison life being. She talks about one of the many ironies of this prison, that many of the women with the longest terms are the least dangerous and led the most useful lives before coming here. ask what their police record before Bedford was, you may hear, well, I got a $40 speeding ticket on the Pennsylvania Turnpike. They were good daughters, good wives, good mothers, and good citizens until the day or night the final straw of cruelty was piled on top of all the other straws. She broke, and her husband or lover was killed. Depending upon the attitude of the judge and the district attorney, they would have been given anywhere from 3 to 25 years to life. Sonia's husband had a habit of breaking her arm. She finally killed him and got 3 years, was out in 2. Garnell found her husband raping her daughter. She killed him and got 8 and 1/3, 25. She's still here. These women are victims as surely as anyone is a victim. And now they are twice victims. They all have children. In a sense, she goes on to say, one could say that prison is an archetype of democracy gone mad. It is power in the hands of people ill equipped to use it wisely. In July of 1984, the Supreme Court of the United States proclaimed, in a 5-4 decision led by then Chief Justice Warren Burger, that no prisoner in the United States has, quote, any right to any personal dignity, unquote.
Wow.
They determined that the Fourth Amendment did not protect prisoners at all, ever, no matter how extreme the circumstances.
Wow.
I think what we're seeing in that is a picture of how a lot of people view prison inmates.
Yeah.
There's a lack of
Humanity.
a lack of humanity, a lack of dignity. Combine that with what we were reading about with the deinstitutionalization of mental hospitals. You've
Yeah.
got this population of really a crazy mix of women, particularly. And then on top of that, grieving the loss of being around their children,
Yeah.
abuses that they've suffered. It's really a sad commentary. It's a sad setting that your mom was in, even though, she obviously committed a crime. She stuck a gun in someone's face, but still,
Mm.
it's remarkable. Judge Stevens went on to say that he felt so appalled by the decision that he chose to read his dissent aloud. By telling prisoners, he wrote, that no aspect of their individuality, from a photo of a child to a letter from a wife, is entitled to constitutional protection. The court breaks with the ethical tradition that I had thought was enshrined forever in our jurisprudence. It's not a fair world that we're living in, whether you're on the inside or the outside. Dignity is so important. Father Gorman is quoted in her book as saying, if the lives of many of these young women could be painted into a picture, the picture would be so ugly for our eyes to see. That doesn't relieve women of their responsibility for their own actions, but it does suggest that all the good people should pause before throwing stones or before deciding
Mm.
who the victims really are. She concludes her book by saying that the justice system and the correctional system, as I have experienced them, fear truth and common sense like the wicked witch of the West feared water. So much of what they decree and condone and profess to believe melt away with a simple application of truth or common sense or compassion. Heaven knows there are plenty of women here who know little about compassion or decency towards others, but they'll never learn about it unless society shows them some first. If the public is wise, it will have sent us here to learn useful lessons, not to be reminded in every conceivable way that we are human refuse of these teeming shores. If the public is wise, the children of inmates who have never hurt others but have only been hurt will be gathered up into our loving concern and taught compassion and the will to learn while there is still time to save them from these hallowed halls.
Wow. That is powerful.
I know that paragraph right there,
Mm.
it screams your name, Nicole, because that's exactly, I think, your experience. For some reason, I met your mom that day, and your mom made the call to place you with Johnny and Chrissy, and it was a few years into you being with them, I believe, that you ended up moving out to California. And correct me if I'm wrong in this story. Your dad was working at IBM.
Hmm.
IBM had reached its heyday, and so he saw the writing on the wall. He quit working there, went out on his own, and he did AV sound for IBM. So he would like set up shows, and when they
Yeah,
would do presentations and such, he was the guy behind the soundboard in the back, right?
exactly.
Mhm. And so he went out on his own, or he partnered with somebody that took him out west to California. Shortly before he moved, he did a couple shows here on the East Coast, and Johnny had hired me to do some backdrops for his biggest client. He landed, which was Apple Computers.
Yeah.
Back in the day, Apple was a nobody, and
Hmm.
they had the brilliant idea to try to get in with all of the school superintendents, and they were going to give a few computers to the schools, and they would set up these shows. And I attended too and built the backdrops for them. And when we're talking backdrops for the main stage, we're talking 10 feet high by 40 feet long. I think Johnny says that it helped him kind of set a tone of professionalism that was pretty cool. They liked it. I
Hmm.
did one show in Boston, and then the next year we did a totally different show in Atlantic City. And then I made a few backdrops for Apple that they toured and did small trade shows with and such. And so those were good times. I made some money. I bought a car, and I don't know what else I did that with that. I wish I would have bought Apple stock.
Yeah, no kidding, right? I think everybody wish they had that foresight.
What the heck was I thinking? But I was young and needed the money. So that's it. I squandered it on a Honda Accord, I think. You guys ended up moving out west after a few
Mhm.
years of hanging out with me. I've got a few pictures of you in different settings. I'll post them so people can see what you were like back in the day.
Those are some of my favorite pictures. Like you definitely had an artistic eye. I feel like you captured the time, the very 80s, very early 90s. Yeah, there's definitely some dope pictures.
Cool. So take it from there. I feel like I've done a lot of the talking. I wanted to set the stage so that people understood what life was like in Bedford Hills. I know you came back and visited Yvonne, and we'll talk about that as time goes on. But tell us about your life with your adopted mom and dad, and where that led you.
So we moved from New York when I was, definitely fairly young. My dad's business kind of ramped up at that time, so we were bi-coastal for a little bit, and obviously technology, even still today, pops in California. Like that seems to be like the epicenter. So we eventually moved completely full time to California, and originally it was Manhattan Beach. That was the first place we were, was Manhattan Beach. I think we were there maybe like 9 months, and then from Manhattan Beach and went to Redondo Beach, so LA, LA County. I was there until I was about in third grade, and then from third grade on till really, young adulthood, I was in San Diego. So that was just kind of the transition of, where we were at that time. A lot of West Coast living. I really had a very blessed childhood for sure. Like I was able to experience things that I know if God didn't intervene, I would not have been able to experience. And don't get me wrong, like obviously when you peel back the layers, I think what we're talking about here is breaking a cycle to create a new cycle. When you do that, the old cycle doesn't go away. Just it doesn't vanish. You know what I mean? There's still things that you have to walk out. But my childhood was definitely great. I went to school out there. I had a regular childhood. I guess my mom was able to stay at home and raise me. My dad was the one that worked, so that was kind of my setup and my surroundings.
Well, there's a few stories that I had heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, okay? Because I was back in New York, and I had never came out to visit you. I guess I regret that in a sense, but I was busy. I was single, working, and trying to make ends meet, and so I would hear bits and pieces about your life. But just in terms of financial stability, and
Oh,
Johnny
yeah.
and Chrissy they love to do life over the top,
Big.
big scale.
But my dad is either feast or famine, so he's like one extreme or the next. Yeah, definitely. That's definitely him.
So I do recall hearing and so maybe even seeing a picture of the Rolls Royce that he liked to drive around in.
He had a Rolls Royce. He had two big offices in California. Um, he was just like he's a big kid, so when he has, like he has.
It's
Um,
almost like getting, winning the lottery for a period of time and then spending all the money.
that's exactly what it was like, 100%.
And I do recall a story where, because Apple had come out, pioneered the flat screen TV, and
Mhm.
so I heard a story where you were the first one, probably in the world, who had a flat screen TV strapped to their four poster bed as a teenager. Is that a true story?
That is a true story. He took a flat screen TV and he definitely put it right up at the like on the poster bed so I could watch TV on it. Like he was very obviously, that was his industry, so he was like at the cutting edge of everything and he made things happen.
Cool. Okay, how about another one? Is it true that you owned a 50-foot yacht that was 5 stories high and traveled to Catalina Island with it?
Almost. It was 3 stories high,
Oh,
not five.
jeez.
It's rough times. Um yes, yes. He owned a yacht. We owned a yacht. Yes, and we did a lot. Oh man, we did a lot of trips on them. We went to Ensenada, we went down to Mexico, we went to Catalina. We spent a lot of time on that boat. That was a big part of my teenage years. I think he got that when I was like 13, 14, 15, 16, around that time frame. Yeah, yeah. We had jet skis. We would be on the jet skis and the boat all the time. San Diego life, like definitely very true Cali life. It was a very charmed time. I'll
Mm.
tell you that. Like that time of my life was extremely, extremely charmed with the financial stability that he was able to bring to the table and offer and that lifestyle that I was able to experience for sure.
Well, I guess the last one I'll add is it true that you were swimming with dolphins in the Bahamas?
Yes. One of my birthdays, they took me out to the Bahamas to swim with the dolphins. This is probably one of my biggest regrets because I was terrified to jump in the water. So I didn't actually get the real full experience of jumping in and swimming with them, but I was there. But yes, definitely, that is true.
Well, I have to say our kids have lived a pretty privileged life, they pale in comparison to your adventures. I hate to use the word privileged, but hey,
It's crazy, man. Like, yeah, when you talk about yeah, and when you talk about God plucking somebody from one extreme and putting them in a completely other extreme, I think that it paints that picture very, very well.
wow. All right. Well, we failed to mention at some point that early on when you moved out west, that your biological mom Yvonne saw that you were going to be better off with Johnny and Chrissy, and she asked them, "Would you adopt Nicole?" And of course, they loved you, and they were willing to give you back. And on a handshake, that was the deal. But upon her
Right.
request, they adopted you, right? And I know there was some drama at the courtroom as the adoption was taking place, just because Joey, who was also in prison, had been brought to the courtroom. And think your mom was actually pretty nervous that because he was not too thrilled with her decision to let you be adopted by Johnny and Chrissy, and I think she was worried for her life. He was in organized crime, even though he was behind bars. I'm sure things can happen, but thankfully nothing ever did. I think. How was it when you were out there communicating with Yvonne? I would assume it was mostly by phone, collect calls, that kind of thing. How often and frequently would you talk to her while you lived out there?
It was spotty. I remember it was a little bit more consistent when I was younger. So I want to say once we were in LA, I was probably like 7 years old, like six, 7, 8. And I remember her calling, and I do remember having conversations with her on the phone and they would be long conversations. And that was like, I used to enjoy it when she would call. Um, and then it went spotty. Like I have like spotty memories of her calling. It got inconsistent for a little while until I was a little bit older in San Diego. So maybe preteens to teens. There was a time that I feel like it dropped off. And I don't know, I think at that point in time, you kind of come to, as an adolescent, you come to a realization. It's weird. It's like you kind of have an awakening. And I think, I don't know if it got spotty just from because she didn't call as much, or I don't know if I was at that point kind of not willing to confront, some of that intersectionality of just having to deal with who you were. You know what I mean? I know there was a time where I didn't want to talk to her when she would call. I would always tell, my mom who I was raised with, tell her I'm not here. Tell her I'm not here. I don't want to talk to her. So I remember it kind of tapering off, and I don't know if that was because of me or if I don't know that was because she stopped calling. But she called definitely heavily when I was young. And then I remember like a reemergence of communication in my preteens.
Nicole, I know ethnically your adopted mom and dad are not the same race as your biological. Can you expound on how that played a role and impacted you growing up?
Yeah, definitely. So as I had such positive experiences, obviously because of the opportunities between how you explained being able to have a normalized childhood, being able to have financial stability and a house with parents and food and things like that, right? There's another element that is just different. A mix of just like Afro Latin countries. So, my community, it's one thing in the Black and brown community. I'm considered light skinned. I'm considered, racially ambiguous. But, when you're raised in a predominantly white environment, you're definitely very other, and that was made very known. I remember being in school and the kids used to call me half breed. I didn't know what to make of it at that time. I didn't understand it. When you're young, you kind of have such an innocence about you. You don't really come into identity. Identity is something that you learn and you build on as you get older. So, yeah, definitely. It was very interesting. The kids used to call me half breed. I remember the teachers used to try and go about figuring out why I looked a certain way and why my parents looked a different way. And they used to try to go about it as kindly as they could, some of them. And then some of them would just be complete, for lack of a better word, about it. I remember being in a room with my computer teacher, and she kind of brought up the conversation very lightly, and she would ask questions like, "Oh, like I love your parents; they're so great. Like your dad is so funny, got such a great personality, such an outgoing guy, and your mom, she's just really sweet." And she would be like, "Where are you guys from?" Right? Like they would edge into the conversation. And then she would just be like, she would ask the question, "Why are you so dark?" And I was 8 years old, and I just kind of remember shying away and just being very uncomfortable with, you know, being other. Your love isn't other, and this is your family, and you identify with them in so many other ways. But this kind of other piece of the natural puzzle just wasn't there. So it was very uncomfortable. I remember, even in that school with that teacher, the principal used to always pick on me. It was predominantly white school. I was always in predominantly white environments, always being one of very few black and brown kids in the environment. And they used to tell my mom when she used to pick me up that I was dressing like a gang member. I was 9 years old. I was a little girl, and I definitely felt very picked on in some of those environments. So kind of having to learn where I fit in. That journey was different. I had different hair textures at different times. That was a journey trying to figure that out.
You used to want to wear boys' underwear too, okay? I don't know if anyone's ever told you that, but when you were like, I don't know, 2 or 3, that was a thing for you.
Oh, I believe it. I definitely believe it. Trying to find my place has always been a thing for me. Community has always been a lost piece of that puzzle because I always felt very different and very other. And even in scenarios that were filled with love, I was always reminded that there is an other element to you. And no matter how that was pulled on, it was always pulled on. So it's been a journey just kind of figuring out how I place, where I place my sense of community, what that looked like for me. That's always been a big hot button for me, is just trying to find that sense of home, trying to find that sense of community. I struggled most in San Diego. LA, as short lived as LA was for me, that was some of the best times I had community wise, because the school that I went to there was a very eclectic school. You had a lot of black and brown kids, and I felt very at home. I had a good, you know what I'm saying, environment. Once we moved to San Diego is when it kind of got a little whitewashed, and it was very tough. That was really, really tough for me. My best friend, who I have to this day, is a young lady by the name of Desiree, and she was the only other mixed kid in our church. And so we created a bond because of that. That was like a commonality. It wasn't like at the forefront of your mind. It just kind of happens to be relatable, and a commonality. It was never like I built relationships off of that by any means. It was just something else that we had in common, where I was built different from a lot of the girls that I grew up with. Here I was, I had curves and hips and big old thighs, and I didn't understand why. And for a long time, I was always very athletic and I played sports, but I took my sports to a completely different level and started distance running, and really got into working out and not wanting to eat calories because I wanted my body to look like the people that surrounded me. And I didn't understand at that time why it didn't. So I did have an eating disorder when I was in my teens. I wouldn't eat fat, and I would run a lot. I was into distance running because of that. I was always trying to make myself look like what I saw around me, because it was never present. I was never really with my community. And that caused, like a double consciousness there of, why am I looking like this and everybody else looks like this, until I was able to kind of come into that healing. So it definitely worked out. Love who I am now. I love my thick thighs and all. You know what I mean? I love my differences. It's my favorite part of who I am, is that. So
I wish I was closer so I could eat your cooking, because, some of the things that I see you put out there for, because you have a little catering thing on the side, is pretty awesome.
thank you. Yeah, definitely. That's been a big part of it, is just kind of tapping into some of that and some of the beautifulness in it, the rhythms, the roots, the food. I'm now able to connect with that and pass that on to my kids. And it's no longer a point of pain. It's definitely a point of celebration for sure. So
Very cool. I recall before you moved out there when you were younger, I would take you to visit her. And I had a job that afforded me some luxuries. And so I bought this little two-seater MR2 sports car, and I'd strap you in the passenger seat. And we'd book down to Bedford Hills. And for a time, she was actually transferred to Rikers Island as well, which was the world's largest prison facility. And so I have, I guess, fond memories of booking down the highway, New York State Thruway, seeing the Hudson River to our right, and going to visit your mom with you. And as you moved out west, I continued to go and visit her, probably as much as 2 to 3 times a month. I recall conversations with her about you, and it was a struggle, I'm sure, on both sides. There's a sadness, and then having read some of those articles from Jean Harris, and from the New York Times, and from the Christian Science Monitor, we get a picture of what life was like for her, which was pretty crazy. It was is really insane, living in the prison system. And so, okay, well, at that point, then you move back to New York. You're 18 or so, and
yeah,
they sold the boat. And
yeah, basically, yep. With his business, his partner did some real shicey stuff. So it was like a kind of like a revamping and a revamping of life. And honestly, at that point, I hit that knucklehead age a little bit. 17, 18. You think you're grown. My mom actually moved back to New York first. He kind of had to settle some things with his business, and I moved out. I was like, all right, well, I'm grown. I'm moving out. I moved out with my boyfriend. Thought I was big time. So she was actually here for, I think, a year or 6 months to a year by herself. He was kind of settling his business affairs, and I was living with my boyfriend at the time. And then we kind of decided, all right, maybe we should jump to New York. He was actually instrumental in that time for me to move because I was ready to stay in California. I had kind of decided I was grown, I was doing my own thing. And he was like, no, you probably should move back and, at least be in close proximity with your parents. And so we moved back to New York around that time.
Did you get an opportunity to go visit Yvonne around that time? I know she had gotten out because her prison sentence was only 5 to 7 years. And let's tell that side of the story. It's kind of the sad part of the whole journey for her. In that, when she got out, she was going to come and live with me, and I had a house and a spare bedroom, and she had tons of support. She had me, she had Johnny and Chrissy, she had Chrissy's parents, the Cocos, and unlike her quote in the Christian Science Monitor that talked about, oh, there's very little support on the outside. They give you $40 and they say, here you go. You're on your own. Even though there was opportunities while she was in prison to better her lot in life with some educational training and parenting classes and that kind of stuff. I get the impression she really didn't take them up on the offer. She didn't get the early release of the minimum of 5 years. They gave her the maximum time. When she got out, she did come to stay at my house, but within a few days, the pull and the
Mm.
draw to go back down to New York City and be a part of probably a criminal element was too strong. Even then, I've read where it's sometimes they feel like they're bigger and stronger behind bars because it's a safety net. Where on the outside, I think Yvonne felt like she was just another ex-con with no marketable skills and no means of making a living. And she was a career criminal. That was all she knew. She was quoted as saying that I this is how I make my living. You reporter, you get a paycheck weekly. I do a freelance gig here as a criminal. Um, and she never was able to escape that mentality, and so she got rearrested. She did another crime shortly after being released and got caught and was back behind bars again, I think for the third time. Three strikes and you're out, New York had at that time. And so she was sentenced, I believe, 17 years to life, or 17 to 25, or 17 to life. She ended up not making it, right? Do you want to tell that side of the story?
Yeah, so by the time I actually moved back to New York, she had already passed, right? So she passed when I was about 15 years old. And that last time that she got placed back in prison, she did get a life sentence. And, I think kind of speaking on some of the things that you just mentioned, we talk about the system, we talk also about patterns and cycles. And I can see where, because I have a lot of her, in me. I feel like I'm a carbon copy. Most anybody who's come into contact with me, and whether it's the way that I look, whether it's the way that I carry myself, my personality, like I'm definitely Yvonne 2.0. And when I think about myself, I think she had a very, even in just the way that she spoke, she had a very entrepreneurial way about her, but it was misguided. And it was put into a cycle that didn't serve her. I know, like in prison, she did a lot of the grievances type programs for the girls, and she had a love for law. Like if I could go back and do everything all over, I'd definitely be a lawyer, and I think that came from her. So I know she took advantage of some things, but I definitely know once you're stuck in a particular cycle and familiarity, I know you have a pull towards that. And I know you said she wants to kind of go live with you, and you were upstate at that point in time. You were at Red Hook. You were in the woods,
Yeah,
and that's
I
you were in
know.
the woods.
I was in the sticks. I was the
Mm-hmm.
redneck in the sticks.
Listen, and I don't even have some of the experiences that she had, obviously. And I remember when my mom first moved from California to here, that's where she went. And she went to Red Hook. And I remember I came to visit and I was like, nah, I can't do this. This is why I'm still in California. So there's multiple things that kind of happened there. But once she got back locked up, she did not make it out from her sentence. She ended up getting diagnosed with lung cancer and really went through that battle and ended up losing that battle in prison. And yes, there were definitely times where I was able to go visit her. I'm kind of foggy exactly on the years and about how old I was, but I think at 13, I think it was like 13, 14, we came back to visit New York, and it was the first time I had seen her since I was a baby, since I was a child. And I remember that visit going to Bedford, I was so nervous. You think that, you're comfortable and you can handle it. And I did. I was comfortable and I could handle it. But being face to face with that environment again did something to me. It did something to me physically. I'll never forget it. I remember driving up there, getting there, and all of a sudden walking onto the premise, I felt sick to my stomach. I was so nervous. I felt sick to my stomach, and I thought it was because like I had some bad Chinese food the night prior. But I as I've gotten older and have kind of uncovered my heart and my process, I definitely do know it was because of my nerves. It's the first time I had seen this woman in over 10 years.
Mm.
And what did that mean to me? Standing toe to toe to your mother. Um, I remember going into Bedford, going through the guards, getting patted down, having to take everything out of your pocket, going through the metal detectors, and walking into that visiting room, and then waiting for her to come out and to finally see her for the first time in a long time. And just sitting there. The one nice thing I will say about Bedford's visiting facilities is not behind the glass.
Mm.
I can't stand behind the glass. I've done that, but it's out in the open so you can sit with whom you're visiting and have contact with them and have a moment. And I remember just kind of during that visit, just trying to catch up as best as you can. So we talked and obviously about a lot of different things and seeing her and learning her and trying to learn about her environment there. And it's tough. It's tough for women. It's definitely not easy. You make affiliations to try and stay safe. I know she would talk about getting jumped, having to learn how to fight and protect herself. And she had a little name, there. They used to call her Sexy or Sexy Walker. She used to get tested. You know what I mean? So I know, like, speaking to her sentencing, I'm curious. I don't know. I don't know if her sentencing was elongated because of just stuff that she was doing, or, is it because of your environment? When you talk about those cycles and those cyclicals, a lot of the environment has negative things as well. So what do you have to do to survive? I think that played a role as well. But I saw her during that time. And then as she got sicker and sicker, she went up into the infirmary in Bedford. So they separated her from general population to the infirmary. And right before that transition, I was able to do a trailer visit with her. So we went to Bedford and we were able to stay for like 3 days. And you stay in a trailer, and anybody that's approved during that time frame, they're in trailers with their families or whomever is approved. And it's just kind of like a little community. It's probably one of my most fond memories, to be honest with you. There was like 3 or 4 different families in there, and we got to stay there and spend the night. That was probably the most time I ever got to spend with her that I can remember. And it was very interesting. It was cool. We got to play games and cook and laugh. She was very sick at that time, so she was not really able to participate as much. The cancer was very progressive, and it really kind of took her out one by one.
Mm. And that was shortly before she passed, correct? I also, because years had gone by for me. At the point where she left my house and decided to go back down to New York and then she got rearrested, I had to tell her, Yvonne, I can't support you anymore emotionally. Not that I was supporting her monetarily, but I was giving her an address for the state to send her checks to, for welfare or whatever. And so I reported her that she wasn't living there anymore. She was not happy with me about that. And, and I just kind of had to say, I just can't be there. I know your grandparents, the Cocos, went faithfully and visited her all through that third prison sentence for the time that they were there. But your grandmother called me, Jean, Yvonne's dying. She probably doesn't have too much longer to live. Would you like to go visit her? And I said yes. And so I went down. I must have gotten there shortly before you because she didn't mention anything about you. When I got there, she was at the hospital. She wasn't even at the facility, and I waited about 3 or 4 hours for her to get back to the facility. Closing visiting hours were closing. There was like 10 minutes left, and she hobbled down the hall to meet with me, and we hugged and just shared some memories and some thoughts of you. And she really was struggling with the whole God issue. Why did God let this happen? Is God really real? What's my fate? When I die and that kind of stuff. So we were able to talk a little bit about that. And yeah, and then she passed away. Her remains were cremated and sent through the mail to, I believe, you guys, and you have them somewhere. It's sad in that respect. So, if you could, let's go back and revisit what life has been like since then. I mean, now I hope you don't mind me saying you're 32, right? So tell us what happened when you got older. What'd you do? You got married. Obviously, you have some kids, right?
Do I got two boys? I have two beautiful sons, handsome sons, 8 and 9 years old. So, yep, I got married, had me some babies. And I guess, I feel like it's, average in the sense that your regular, typical, household. Have a husband, have two kids. My boys, they go to school. They're going to school here in New York, regular elementary school, play sports. I work. My husband works. So very, I guess a very normal, typical family lifestyle with, trying to raise your kids and do some fun things along the way.
That's so cool that we broke the cycle, right, Nicole? We were successful. I guess not that I take any credit. I don't know who gets the credit. I guess God gets the credit. Just His mercies are new every morning. And so, how did becoming a parent yourself, affect you in terms of your relationship with Yvonne? Did that really trigger some old memories or just emotions about her choices?
Big time, definitely. I would say it in multiple ways. One, when I found out I was pregnant, one of the first things I did is because I started having those emotions and some of those triggers even prior, to birthing. So once I realized I was pregnant, the first thing I did was enroll myself into a healing class, because we talk about, the buck stopping here and breaking that cycle. So even though God had given me such a different story to write, when I talk about the cycles with her and why I can identify with it is because I'd never done a lot of the things that she did, thank God, and I never had run-ins with the law. But I had such a strong pull to a lot of that stuff, believe it or not. I would dibble dabble and I would run back out, and dibble dabble and run back out. And just doing your own little knucklehead things when you're young and you're stupid and you're a teenager and you're battling with who you are, what God has given you, and what that looks like in your life. So just kind of walking that process out. The first thing I did when I found out I was pregnant is I enrolled in the healing course, and that whole buck stops here. That was really big for me. Making sure that some of those things are not given to my child. So one of the things I dealt with after birthing was that bond. As weird as it sounds, like I really, really, really had to work for my bond with my kids. It didn't come natural. And I think that has to do with breaking that bond with my biological mother so soon. I've always been the type of person that I can have a relationship and an emotional bond with somebody, but as soon as you're out of sight, you're out of mind. It's like it never was. So that disconnect kind of has always been there throughout the course of my life. So creating a bond with a child proved to be very, very difficult. It was something that I did not emotionally feel immediately and naturally. It took some work and it took some digging. So yeah, definitely that was brought up for me. That was a trigger. And the element of forgiveness was definitely a trigger too, because once you have a kid and you realize what type of love that is, how that compels you, you'll do anything for that child. And even though if things didn't pan out the way that you necessarily wanted it to, you realize that people do the best they can with what they have. And that is encompassing. And that allowed me so much more healing than anything else that I had really experienced. even searching for that healing. So this is definitely a two-part thing.
Mhm. Well, I'm sure there's a lot of people that can relate to that. Thanks for sharing your heart. Well, we're not going to leave it there because as I was doing research on our story, our interview, and all this, I stumbled upon something that I wasn't aware of. Especially since I've left New York 15 years ago. It's kind of weird in that you moved out west when I was back east, and then I moved out west when you moved back east. So you and I really haven't had that much interaction either, which is, a shame. I wish I would have been there for your birthdays and the wedding and the kid's birth and hanging out and such, but it just wasn't meant to be, which is okay. But when I found out that in 1986, there was a sister, a Catholic nun by the name of Sister Tessa Fitzgerald, and she lived close by Bedford Hills there. She had a heart for the infants and children that were a part of Bedford back then. And she actually started by developing a home, like a foster home almost, in Long Island City, Queens, for children whose mothers were incarcerated, and she got to know the mothers when she brought their children to visit and quickly realized that the women would need additional support if they were to successfully reunite with their children after their release. And so she started something called Our Children, HOUR, Our Children. The name acknowledges the key hours that impact the life of a child with an incarcerated mother: the hour of her arrest, the hour of her visit, and the hour of their reunification. And so this nonprofit was in its infancy during the time that Yvonne was in that prison. And over the years now, 30 years, right? It's grown into this behemoth of a nonprofit. It's the leading provider of services to incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women at Bedford Hills. It focuses on women and their children. They support families during a mother's incarceration and help families get back on their feet upon release. It was incorporated in 1992. So the same year that you were adopted is the year that Our Children became incorporated. And just to tout some of the services that they offer, they have supportive housing. They provide transitional and permanent housing in both communal and independent settings. Residents are supported by a robust array of case management and mental health services for both women and their children. They have our Working Women program, and so they have job training, educational opportunities, and mentoring, providing women the essential skills to find success in the workplace. They have an Our Community food pantry open to both clients and wider community. It's a supermarket style food pantry providing healthy, nutritious options. They have programs for children and teens, which offer a variety of engaging and meaningful programs for children who are a part of our community from infancy straight through the teenage years. They have a thrift shop, two locations offering affordable shopping, provide jobs and training for the women, and earn revenue to help fund their programming. The two programs that they oversee that are special in our discussion today really are the residential nursery there at Bedford Hills, and then the Children's Center Playroom. The residential nursery, Our Children operates the nursery inside the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility now, where mothers can live with their infants for up to 18 months, providing infants born during their mother's incarceration with critical bonding time with their mom. During the day, while the moms are attending school, mandated programs are working, the infants are cared for in the Child Development Center, which is staffed by Our Children employees and women who are incarcerated within the facility. And then the Children's Center Playroom in the visiting rooms at Bedford Hills provides a child friendly environment with age appropriate games and seasonal creative art projects that are designed to encourage mothers and child bonding and creation of valuable memories. Birthdays are celebrated in the playroom during a child's visit. In the past year alone, 89 children benefited from nurturing mentor relationships through a program they provide called Our Friend Indeed. They provided supportive housing to nearly 200 women and children in last year alone. 158 women took advantage of employment training and placement services at our Working Women's program, making them more qualified for living wage jobs. 80 children were able to spend a week in the summer visiting with their mothers at Bedford Hills through the summer program. Nearly 10,000 people shopped at our community food pantry last year. 100% of the children participating in Our Friend Indeed and Our Teen Scene remained enrolled in school and avoided involvement with the criminal justice system and gang activity. And I think the most impressive thing is that women who receive support from our children's programs are 5 times less likely to return to prison. The recidivism rate through their outreach has dropped just exponentially. And I can't help but think that had this program been to this degree then when your mom was there, that she might have actually been able to take advantage of the training and the support. And maybe she wouldn't have made that decision to go back into a life of crime that third time. And she'd be here today to be a grandma to your kids. And so I'm just so heartwarmed towards this nonprofit, Our Children, that I decided to do something pretty special because as you know, I'm a home improvement enthusiast and I love to do makeovers. And I've talked a little bit in my intro how I wanted to switch gears from doing my own projects in my own houses because they do lack the fulfillment and joy, unlike building something in someone else's life. And so I've decided to and have I've literally contacted them, told them we were going to be doing this interview, and told them we wanted to do something. We want to develop this army of do-gooders that can really just make a difference. It's almost like we want to do criminal justice reform right here and even education reform because what I'm doing is a makeover of their children's center there. And so we've purchased some tables and chairs and play sets and a little kitchenette set. And the most special is a bookcase. They've always had a library there for the kids to be able to read books with their mothers or grandmothers, those that come and visit, as well as the infants. New studies are saying that kids' brains are such that they should be read to at birth. It used to be 6 months old, begin reading, but now it's read to your children even as they're infants. And so what we decided to do is create a giving library where we stock the bookcases with age appropriate, socio emotional appropriate books that could then be distributed to the kids as they read them with their mothers and grandmothers. They can take them home with them and further that bonding process. And so we're opening up the invitation to anybody that's listening who would like to buy a book or two and join us in creating that next chapter and breaking the cycle, hopefully for countless other people. We're partnering with Scholastic Books. Scholastic has a social justice arm called FACE, Family and Community Engagement. And so they make these books available to schools and community groups that are in need at a discounted price, 40 to 70% off and free shipping. And so our children, people, have opened up an account with FACE, and anybody that donates a few dollars will go into an account where they then purchase books through FACE, through Scholastic, to put books, brand new books. Because when I ask them, well, where are the books come from? They're like, well, whatever gets donated secondhand, that's usually what ends up on the bookshelves there. And I have this vision that we can do better than that for these kids because they, just like you didn't necessarily deserve to be in that prison. The kids that come and visit from all over the state, they're suffering, and to be able to provide for them something as simple as a new book to encourage literacy, I know it will change something in them. It's really the least we can do. And so, anyone listening, if you want to follow suit, you're welcome to go to ourchildren.org. Remember, it's HOUR, children.org. And click on the donate button, and there's a comment section. You can say you're doing it for Nicole or Yvonne or the Giving Library that Jean Rule and her podcast is creating. They know me by now there, so they'll be able to put your dollars to work purchasing books for that library. And my hope is that this podcast will be listened to for years and years to come, and whoever listens to it is going to be impacted by it, and hopefully moved to be able to give a few dollars to such. You can also give more if you want. Of course, they have a lot of other programs that you're more than welcome to donate to. There is a matching program too, so you may want to go in and see if your employer is listed there as a matching contributor, because they'll double your gift if you are, which is pretty awesome. Well, I have a few parting questions to ask you. What would you say to a child whose mom's incarcerated right now?
Ooh, that's good. That's a good question. I know it hurts. I know it's uncomfortable. And I know that there's a lot of questions that come up. For me, the question of being enough always came up. Like, why wasn't I enough to change your course in life? Because you think it should look a certain way. You are enough, and it's not you. It's not your fault. It's not anything that you lack that causes that person to be in the scenario that they're in. I would definitely say listen to yourself, love yourself. It hurts now, but it's going to get better. And be gentle with your process. I think everybody kind of has a timing in their process. For that kid, be gentle with allow yourself to process.
Thank you for that. How about to the person who doesn't feel like their volunteering makes an impact? Let me preface this by just saying, having done that little stint of volunteering at that jail that year in 1986, having met you, well, your mom and eventually you, really did alter the course of my life. It opened up my eyes to the impact that I can make in someone's life with a small volunteering opportunity. And anybody that knows me equates me with volunteering. And I've done it everywhere I've lived. And that's probably in part why I know so many people. And when I started brainstorming about this podcast and I wanted to revisit people, I literally came up with like 100 people in 15 minutes of who I can interview. And part of that is because you meet people when you're volunteering and you connect with them on different levels. And so it's always been a passion of mine. And I hope to convey that to my kids. My two kids, they're crossing their fingers and hoping this summer, Sam and Lauren are both spending their entire summer as an 18-year-old and a 20-year-old volunteering with a ministry that helps build up and support teens. And so I feel like that is my legacy that I'm relaying onto my kids. And so much of it, its roots are rooted in my experience with your mom and some of the things that I learned through her. I learned what courage is. I learned what unconditional love is and fortitude and so many things that I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity to meet her. But what would you say to the volunteer who doesn't feel like they're making a difference?
That's just, I think, something that's a lie. It may feel like you're a drop in the ocean, but man, I tell you, it only takes that one drop to make such a ripple effect. You definitely, everything, all of your efforts are not in vain. It is so important for people to answer that inkling. Like, if you're curious about volunteering, or if that's in you in any way, shape, or form, it can only be multiplied. I'm definitely a testament to that, and the testament to your volunteership. And it's really just, obviously it's affected not just the course of my life, but the generations that come after me. I think it's very important. I think it's pivotal. I think it's one of the best things that you can do. And I think, if I may, I can't speak for you, but it continues to impact you even to this day as much as it's impacted me. So it's extremely important. I definitely think, yeah, there's nothing that you can do that's ever too little in the grand scheme of things. I think it's all great.
I know. I was 23. Can you imagine? I went into that
So
jail.
sweet.
My kids are almost
Mm,
23. I just
mm,
can't imagine them,
Whitney.
you know,
Woo.
doing that. How about, I'm sure your adopted mom and dad will be listening to this and beaming with pride as they hear you speak. What would you say to them?
I love them. I mean, they're, that's my family. I love them. They've sacrificed and they've gone through the good and the bad and the ups and the downs. And none of this for anybody involved, no matter what role you played, is always easy. There's no handbook to anything like this. This is very different. So, we all kind of just did the best we could with everything that we were given, and it's so good and it's so God. Something beautiful was definitely birthed from it. So, we all have a family because of it.
Well, and it didn't hurt that they're like this amazing Italian family, and your grandma was like the best cook ever, and just
Yeah,
loved
no,
on
none of
you.
that ever hurt.
None of that hurt. And I have to say that, as you know, we ended up adopting my grandnephew, Jace, and and it doesn't really go unsaid that we're older, and it takes modeling or being inspired by other people's doing it ahead of us. And so we're really standing on the shoulders of Johnny and Chrissy and their ability to adopt you and raise you and just benefit from just, how that builds community, builds family. And so we stepped up to the plate to do that for Jace. And so here we are going about doing exactly what they did for you. So I hope Jace someday grows up and does an interview like this and has fond things to say about us, as you were saying about your adoptive mom and dad. And lastly, what would you say to Yvonne? Usually, I'm thinking as I go forward in this podcast, I'm going to ask a lot of people to look forward in time. Let's bury a time capsule, and if it was dug up down the road, what would you say to whoever? But in your case, we're going to start out by going backwards, and we're saying if Yvonne was here, what would you say to her?
I love you. I don't feel like I was ever really able to say that, when she was here, and not with the understanding of what I have today. I always was, man, I always kind of played peekaboo with my feelings in regards to her, but I'm grateful. I love you. I see you. You're with me every day. I feel like I am the physical embodiment of what she wanted. I have love. I have kids. I have them. They're doing good. I'm doing good. Everything that she wanted for me, I think I have, or I'm on my path to getting it even greater. So I thank you for your sacrifice. You're here with me, and I feel like you're doing it all with me. So I love you.
Awesome. And what do you see for your future? What do you hope to achieve? You have such a powerful presence, Nicole. You have charisma and a sense of authority, but in a very humble way, very similar, I think, to your mom and dad. Johnny and Chrissy are a blend, definitely, of Yvonne and Johnny and Chrissy. And so I can only think that God would want to use you to give back, and maybe even in these areas that we've talked about, prison or criminal justice or troubled youth or something like that. But where do you see yourself in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years?
Oh, that's a good question. I can definitely see myself doing some community work. The older I've gotten, the more I realize how important that is and how important action is. I can see myself in some level of politics, whether it's local or whether it's just volunteering. I've always It's funny. I've always kind of steered away from the system. It's one thing when you're born in a system, what that does to you mentally and emotionally, it makes you want to be everything but the system because you think that's where your freedom lies. As I get older, I realize that you need to impact that system in order to bring that sense of freedom and positivity and goodwill back. So yeah, I could definitely see myself doing community work, whether it's in politics or out of politics. But I'm also very entrepreneurial in a way. I think, I said that with Yvonne, she just kind of she went the wrong direction with it, but I'm a creator in so many different ways. I have a podcast to where I have a platform that I'm able to speak about different things. My podcast is called Disruptive Innovation. I feel like that's me in every single scenario. I disrupt the norm, just didn't really have a choice. So that's an avenue of being able to give back by just putting light and truth on things and different spins on things and giving people like yourself a platform to be able to speak about their journey. I'm innovative. I have a couple apps that are in production. So, I like technology, go figure. I like being innovative and things like that. And, I'm about community, and I'm about people being able to speak their truth and gaining freedom through that. So I guess if I answer the question.
Cool. Well, that reminds me and I think I mentioned it, but it's worth repeating that, when I met Yvonne, because I was very creative and innovative too, I always have been. I'm an idea person. We had this idea to create a company, Yvonne and I. Here she is behind bars, and then we brought in another friend of mine, Yao, who's like an Asian guy, and so the three of us were going to do is called Mag Industries because that was like the initials of all our names. It was a catalog that was marketed to prison inmates because there's a lot of them around the country and they do have a little bit of money to buy things. And so it was called Inmate Express. And we launched it. Our pilot program was right in Bedford Hills, and so I would go to trade shows and find things that women would like. Makeup, lipstick, nail polish was a huge one. And so we made up a little catalog and then gave it to Yvonne and she distributed it in there. And these women would order things and I'd get the orders in the mail with their little checks from Bedford Hills. And I'd
Oh
fill
my
the
gosh.
orders and such. And so this was, when you think about it, this is like, 19, probably around when you were adopted. So maybe 1990, 1992 ish. It didn't pan out because, back then it was so hard to find stuff to sell. You had to go to like these trade shows to find, a supplier that sold socks or something. But today
Right.
it's like you just have the internet, so but it was really kind of innovative. It's almost like Amazon,
Yeah.
only targeted just to prison inmates. And I wish I would have stuck with it. I know. I wish I would have
Yeah.
bought Apple stock, continued with the idea. I probably would be a millionaire today, but that's okay. What I have is more valuable than that because I have you and some really fond memories. And I want to close, Nicole, by but sharing something that's been pretty special. Back in 1992, I can't really recall whether or not your mom had decided to give you up for adoption first or whether this song by Whitney Houston had really motivated her and put what her heart was feeling into words. And so I want to encourage our listeners to. I'll read it, but if you don't, after listening to this podcast, download or search out Whitney Houston's song "I Will Always Love You," yeah, I'm sorry, you just have a cold heart. It's just you just have to do it. That and then go to the ourchildren.org website and donate a few bucks. But Whitney Houston, 1992. She came out with a song written by Dolly Parton called "I Will Always Love You." It was the soundtrack to the eventual movie The Bodyguard. But these are the words. And over the years, as I would go visit Yvonne and she would talk about you, this song was always in our minds. We would reference it often in relation to you. And I recall over the years, I would oftentimes send you different versions of this song just randomly. I think the last one I sent you last year was a bunch of dogs like barking this song. It's a crazy world, I know, but one thing that I do regret, I wish I had a decent voice, but I'm not a singer, and
Tell
so
me.
so all I can do is read it. But it's still worth reading, and then we'll close, okay? If I should stay, I would only be in your way. So I'll go, but I know I'll think of you every step of the way, and I will always love you. I will always love you. You, my darling, you. Bittersweet memories. That's all I'm taking with me. So goodbye. Please don't cry. We both know I'm not what you need, and I will always love you. I will always love you. I hope life treats you kind, and I hope that you'll have all you dreamed of. And I wish to you joy and happiness. But above all of this, I wish you love. And I will always love you. 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 You, darling, I love you. Oh, I'll always love you. Well, and Whitney, you got to love Whitney. She knocks it out of the park. So I guess we got to let these listeners go off and do two things, right? They're going to listen to Whitney Houston's song, "I Will Always Love
Yes.
You." They have to do that, okay? And then they need to go to ourchildren.org and make a small donation. Doesn't have to be anything big, but keep those books flowing in that library. That will just be so awesome to be able to do criminal justice reform, education reform in a way that, like you said, it's not having to be a part of the system. I mean, it's just us. It's you, me, it's whoever's listening. Hopefully thousands will take it upon themselves to not think, oh, well, the government's going to do that, or oh, well, they deserve it. It's like, no, come on, let's all pitch in and make a difference in the lives of these families, because look at what the result was in your life coming up alongside you. Pretty
Yeah.
amazing when you take those chances, when you take those risks in life. The blessings far outweigh the risks and the sacrifices that you make to get it there. So thank you, Nicole.
I'm glad we did this. Whew, I was nervous. Anybody listening? If I sound like I ramble, if I was